Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Return to Work, Balancing Employee Privacy and Workplace Safety in HR, presented by HR Morning and sponsored by Everbridge. My name is Ty, and I will be your moderator for today's 60-minute program. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box in the control panel. If they're regarding the subject being presented, I'll add them to the queue for questions at the end. Now I'd like to introduce your speakers, Prashant Derisi and Michelle Cousins.
Well, thank you very much and welcome everyone. We'd like to thank both of our sponsors for today's session. And before Prashant starts today, he is really the technical subject matter expert on some tools that can be very helpful with a lot of the issues that you're all facing. And my role is really to think about this in the context of the general organizational considerations as well as HR considerations as well. And so what we're going to be talking about today is some of the challenges that everyone's facing as we try to move our organizations forward in this very interesting day and age and environment that we're all working in. And then what are some of the considerations or elements that need to be contemplated as people are returning to work or continue to return to work. And so that's everything from understanding the risks associated, defining and executing what that operational framework is going to look like, and of course, protecting your people. And that means that we'll also be talking about contact tracing, but we'll even go beyond what maybe you've already heard or seen in that regard and really focus on safety, privacy, and security. Once that portion is done, we will have some time left where Prashant and I will have some Q&A talking about, from my perspective, where I see some questions that I think that you all will have in your own minds regarding how HR can wrap their head around all of this. So that's what we have for you today. And so looking at what the concerns are that we're all contending with out there today, obviously we have just more and more competition than ever before. In fact, I think that sometimes when the economy and businesses are going through difficult times, we actually see competition emerge from even other industries that start to encroach upon ours or from new innovations. So we not only have a lot more competition, but certainly globally. And even if you're a small business that you say operates locally, if you have a website, keep in mind that you are part of that global infrastructure. And so we've got to understand the implications of all of that connectivity that's going on. And of course, even relying on not just our customers that might be international, but our vendors and other connections. The economic uncertainty obviously is a very hot topic. Even before this pandemic that we've been going through, we saw that while the macro numbers might have suggested a rosy picture, behind the scenes, you saw that some industries were already suffering. You saw that certain occupations had difficulties, and that certainly there was a lot of what we call unevenness underneath the surface. And that could also be even in terms of different demographics and geographics. Certainly that uncertainty has heightened because of the pandemic as well as other conditions and ripple effects, frankly. Environmental concerns. I think we're seeing that a lot has happened to sort of accelerate people's consideration of climate issues and their overall impact or footprint on the environment, not only because maybe the public is asking what companies are doing, but also because it's a way of actually saving money for the companies themselves and streamlining. And then customer expectations obviously have continued to increase as well. Customers have access to more information than ever before. They have access to doing things themselves more, and not just in their decision making, but in how they choose to interact with companies as well. And so overall, I would say that in all of those categories, as well as more generally, we're seeing a lot more technological change today than ever before. In fact, I think that once we do end up sort of coming out of the worst of the pandemic, you're going to find that there are just many, many new technological innovations. And I think that's actually pretty exciting and something to maybe look forward to. And so even today, you'll hear about how technology can be instrumental in helping us to protect our companies and our people. So we've got more of these first-time business disruptions, whether it's thinking about hacking and sabotage. That look, even on some of the calls that people are doing, we're seeing that calls get interrupted and people Zoom bomb them, so to speak, or that data gets held hostage for a price, or even just that personal information about people is getting out and then into the wrong hands. Supply chain wise, anyone who relies on a supplier or they rely on the buyer, of course, in front of them, they're seeing a lot of disruption in supply chains as a result of all of this dislocation we're going through as a result of not just the pandemic, but a lot of these reliances. And increasingly, companies are sort of interdependent across different industries. And so if there's any ripple at all in not only what is happening in your business but also to other businesses that you tend to rely on the front end or the back end, those can significantly impact your revenues and certainly your profitability. So of course, last but not least, we're dealing with this particular pandemic, but keep in mind that this is a big wake-up call, not only in relation to the health concerns, but also the fact that not enough companies really have robust contingency planning in place, have precautions in place, and the more that we learn this time, hopefully we ever go through this health type crisis again, we are all going to be better prepared. And I like to say that 9/11, as horrific as it was, really changed how everyone did a lot of things, particularly in relation to banking, right? A lot more people started doing e-banking. And similarly, you're going to see that this pandemic is going to cause people to do a lot more using technology and a lot more online. So those are some of the things that I think are concerning, but at the same time, they're things that if you're really trying to stay on top of these things, your business can actually come out on top. So we have some challenges associated with this particular pandemic situation, looking at, how do we restore our business operations, whether you had shut down completely or maybe you had been partially shut down during that time. How can you transition people back to your site? And making the choices about who you transition back and when. What should you do to prepare for the potential resurgence? They're saying that we're going to see, as a result of some of the behavior, even over a past holiday weekend, we're going to see into the late fall potential other resurgence on this, in addition to the flu season. And how can we incorporate lessons that we've learned from this crisis as we move forward? So thinking about developing guidelines and procedures, assessing your workplace against, the needs and conditions, coordinating between HR, legal, and management, determining your exposure risk level, and then of course making sure that that you're even doing simulations on what could happen. So I'm going to turn this over to Prashant because he's going to share more on some of these effects, and then also the things that you can do to protect your workplace and your people. All right, so Prashant, I'll turn it over to you.
Michelle, thank you very much. That was very well said. The challenges as you laid out and the dimensions of the problem. Pandemic is just one aspect of the human condition these days. And yes, it is the center of our attention. This is where we worry about our employees and perhaps more importantly, our family members, elders especially, and children, and what kind of a future we are going to give to the generation to come, given this particular situation. But the reality is, as we look at solutions that can help us through this pandemic, couple of things we have to realize is that this problem is not going to be solved just because we start a summer project and bring kids back to school, or come fall after everybody's taken a flu vaccine, you can open up your branch offices even with the guidelines in place. We have to look at this bigger than either a project or a product, because until we as a society have confidence in the efficacy of not just the vaccine, but the new systems that we have put in place, like you just said, this pandemic will change our way of life. We are looking at an operational framework. And the reason we do that is that one size cannot fit all, right? If we actually go and look at the various states in North America today, if you look at the various countries in the European Union, each one of them is reacting, putting and defining guidelines as it pertains to their community and their society. But we are in a in a macroeconomic situation where we are geographically dispersed. We have, as HR person, you are responsible for branch offices not just across a single state, but state, countries, continents. So there are cultural considerations, there are legal considerations, and there are regulatory and compliance reasons by which we need to start thinking of this operational framework as something that will be our way of life for years to come. Right? So given that, what should we start really looking at from the perspective? First is the recognition that if any of us have been anywhere close to Texas, we know what just happened, right? With the hurricane slamming us and the enormous damage that it has caused. The other reality is if any of you and your branch offices or your employees are in the California belt, I don't need to tell you, the havoc that the wildfires are causing. And then there are going to be silly people that are going to do silly stuff. There are protests. We are in a current climate, both political and economic, that we will see, unemployment rise, protests go up, civil unrest as a result of the social conditions that we are all expecting. But that is the reality within which we need to start defining the operational framework. Pandemic is the prime driver, but this is bigger because hurricanes are not stopping, wildfires are not stopping, and we do have, especially in this country, elections coming up very soon. So given that reality, I believe there are three essential elements that we need to keep in mind as we try to operationalize our new world, a new way of life. And if we can do this correctly, the next generation of hiring, the next generation of employee satisfaction, morale, the Glassdoor reviews that we are going to all discuss will be about those companies where HR managers have been able to implement these elements successfully. How well do you take care of your employees? What kind of facilities have you afforded them as part of these changes that you're putting in place? And finally, how are you ensuring that you're protecting them and also reducing liability? There are two aspects of it. The second aspect almost never gets discussed is the concept of liability. We all understand workplace guidelines, and unless you can be aware of the changing regulations around you, liability is a significant risk. So we start by understanding the macro level environment that we all operate in. What are our risks? What are the multiple crises that we are managing for those HR people that had employees in Texas, or currently those companies that have their employees living or working in and around the California belt where the wildfire is? The concept of a pandemic and its risk is very different than somebody that only has to deal with the pandemic. Once we can understand the big picture of what the risk looks like, I think we can define and put in place an operational framework, right? So understanding our landscape, defining a process that we need to follow should automatically lead to both a proactive way of protecting our people, but also a reactive way, because the reality is that they will only spend a certain amount of time in the office. They are citizens of the community. They will be going and doing groceries. They will take their families out, right? So there has to be a reactive component of putting this operational framework in place should you receive the bad news that an employee has tested positive or certain other untoward incident has occurred. So given that, let's start with understanding, our risks. Yeah, this is publicly available information. I mean, you can go to the Johns Hopkins University, you can go to CDC. I'm pretty sure countries are publishing their numbers as well. But like we just discussed, and the way Michelle was laying out, supply chain, competitive environment, right, and the challenges that we are facing, I think it's very important to understand and have a centralized view of what that risk means to you. Give you a simple example. This hurricane that just came in Texas, uh, significant effort was spent in evacuating people from the low-lying areas or those that were in the harm's way. Now, the problem is when you have a guideline by the governor or the mayor where everybody is supposed to maintain a distance, but then you have a wide swath of your geographical area that is going to blast you. You have to now evacuate people to some common areas, like a football stadium, like a high school. How do you enforce social distancing? How do you make sure that there are enough masks, PPEs, the correct hand sanitizers, food and shelter for those people that are congregating in a public place? So it becomes very, very hard if we don't have a centralized view of how to look at risks, not just the pandemic, but anything from a road closure to the disruption to supply chain, to the changing guidelines, or even the weather forecast model. So whatever solution you folks are considering, whatever tools you're looking at, one of the most important things that I would urge we all have in our hands is one single place in, possibly automated fashion where you can see these continuous changes and quickly react to the changes in the situation. After having done that, after having understood our risks, that's when we get to the next step of defining an operational framework. Now, in this specific case, in the interest of making sure that whatever we define is replicable, is scalable, and you can take the best practices from one branch office to another, one country to another, one city to another, right? While you can define all your task lists and items, also make sure that you have a way to understand the local laws. So as you can see in this particular screen, whether it's London, Boston, or Paris, the steps that we need to take to make sure that employees can return back to work safely are exactly the same. But what you're seeing on the right-hand side is where the nuances come in. If you're in United Kingdom, the guidelines you need to follow or your facilities manager needs to look at or your administrative officers or risk officers need to follow is very different, right, than what you do in North America, which is again, very different than how it could be in France, right? So the idea of the operational framework is to ensure that you give certain tools in the hands of the people that are responsible for your local region to say, while we all understand what a good practice looks like, marrying that best practice, good practice with the continuously changing guidelines is equally important. And once we have this framework in place, now I believe we are ready to fulfill our duty of care obligation, right? And that is, hey, how do I bring an employee back to work safely, make them work in a safe environment, and should something happen, what are the processes I need to follow as a result of this? So once you've defined those things, let's keep moving forward to try and understanding another aspect of an operational framework, and that is your process flow. Right now, you can customize this to the same guidelines and rules and regulations that I talked about. But here are some thoughts on how you might want to do this as you start opening branch offices. Maybe, maybe you want to conduct an initial baseline survey. While all the employees are healthy, given the current situation, many of them may not be comfortable to return to work no matter how many times you've sanitized the workplace, how far the cubes have been moved to, right? They're just not comfortable, coming back to work. So maybe I can suggest that we start with establishing a baseline survey. Are you even interested in returning back to work? Alternatively, you can leverage the initial baseline survey to try and understand what percentage of my employee population is not only willing to work, but is also able to return to work, right? Are your employees living with somebody that has compromised immunity? Are your employees living with somebody that have very elderly people in the house? Or are they living with very young children, right, that need a lot more care than simply saying, hey, go to a remote school? So the idea of establishing a duty of care initial baseline package is something that I can suggest as something we operationalize. Now let's say that, based on the initial baseline, you have decided that you have about 80% of the people that are willing and able to return to work. And come September 15th, or come Columbus Day, I'm going to open my offices. That's where the second aspect of the operational framework needs to come into picture. And that is, while you are eligible and able to return to work, how are you feeling today? Right? Have you shown any symptoms? Right? Has somebody in your family shown any symptoms? What's happening in the environment from which you're going to start the commute? Is your particular county, is your particular town seeing an increased trend of COVID? In which case, you don't want that employee to come to office, right? So that's where the concept of a daily wellness check comes into picture, right? That can qualify people and make sure that they are good to return to work on that particular day. And this is something that you should operationalize every day, or make sure that you operationalize this based on the calendar of the person. If somebody says, hey, I'm willing to come back to work, but only Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Well, then why don't we conduct a wellness check only on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday? And then it gets to your doors, your company doors as well. Now you can get very exotic with use cases, right? There are companies that we have spoken to where folks have said you are approved for arrival at the facility, but once you come to the facility, please go to this tent located in the parking lot B, where somebody will take your temperature check and then issue you an entry badge. Some are even going further with automation and installing thermal mirrors, right? And as an employee walks through the doors, it's checking the temperature of the individual and raising an alert if the temperature happens to be, let's say, over 100 degrees. But the point is, you don't have to exactly copy the process that we are sharing here. But my suggestion would be define some framework that gets executed every day. And I would suggest do it in an automated fashion to make sure that you have a seamless way of ensuring that employees are coming back to work. They also feel good about the fact that you are actually asking the right questions, giving the proper guidelines, and ensuring workplace safety. What you see at the bottom is the unhappy path. Obviously, right? We don't want and wish this on anybody, but should an employee test positive, should an employee report that they're experiencing symptoms that sound similar to COVID-19, what do you do then, right? Maybe some employees need to be directed towards a quarantine. Some people that might be showing mild symptoms, you as an HR team might have had some agreement with CVS, Quest Diagnostics, Walgreens, LabCorp. Maybe you direct your employees to go to one of these testing facilities, show their employee badge, and get a test done for free, and the results being sent back to both you and the employee, right? Or you might want to actually take that employee record and say, let me initiate the concept of contact tracing. Let me figure out who else have you spent time with in the last 14 days, because you've been coming to office for the last 14 days, last 30 days, last 60 days. Let me figure out who else might be at risk within my organization. So these are some of the examples of the frameworks that we can offer that you should define in place. Like I said, based on your needs, based on your privacy concerns that you have, what you're allowed to ask and not ask, you can design these frameworks in place. And then obviously, this is not going to be solved by just HR folks. You need help, right? Just like others need your help. There are obligations that a facilities team needs to fulfill. right? You have a sanitization staff which you might have outsourced that needs to come in every evening and clean the mouse, clean the monitors, clean the tables, desks, chairs, right? IT departments have to do their work. Security officers that sit at the front door, they have to do some work. There are packages coming in and out once you open the offices. How do you treat those packages? Do you sanitize them? So administrative officers around the company may have some obligations, but the idea is make sure that that operational framework has clear responsibilities and layers of accountability that demonstrates who needs to do what and when, right? Once they know what they're supposed to do, ensure that you communicate effectively. Where should people go once they feel good? Where should people go when they're not feeling well? What is the facilities manager supposed to do when somebody comes forward and says, I'm not feeling well? What is IT department supposed to do as they're provisioning your remote access? Somebody's laptop has a problem, but you got to get close to the employee to fix the laptop. So all these departments need to know what to do, where to go, especially on the negative test case of saying, hey, somebody in this office just tested positive. What should we do? So we need to prepare those plans in place and make sure that we communicate effectively. And then also try and understand what kind of environment our employees are operating in, right? Do you have the idea of a hot incident zone? Let's say that there is a significant protest just outside your branch office, given the current political climate. Would you really want your employees to come back to work? So that kind of an understanding to know what other risks impact my behavior, my employees' safety, and how the return to work framework works is very, very important, right? Whether it's a weather event, a civil unrest, a protest, I think we need to have enough data in our hand in terms of risks to understand that I can communicate effectively to people and say, look, Michelle, you are supposed to come back to work today, but I've just received notification that by the time your shift ends, there is a significant protest planned just outside our branch offices. And when you commute on your way back to home, you might get caught. Best you don't come to office today, even though you're feeling well. I'm automatically informing your manager that you will not be showing up in office today. So that kind of an operational framework where you have a 360-degree view of how to protect employees is very, very important. And it's only after we have defined those operational frameworks, we can discuss the concept of protecting our people. Now, this is where we can talk about the most popular topic of the day, and that's contact tracing, right? But before we get to the concept of contact tracing, we need to make sure that we look at this from end to end. And what do I mean by that? In any situation that we are faced, any problem that we have, leveraging just one piece of technology to solve the problem is a dangerous way to live, right? And for many reasons. And as it pertains to contact tracing, nothing is truer than this specific use case. Contact tracing, from the way we all understand, is the concept where all employees or individuals carry a smartphone. They have to give you consent. They have to give consent by clicking. They have to enable Bluetooth. And then there is this magical exchange of keys where you spend 15 minutes with somebody within 6 feet and keys get exchanged. When one person reports positive, somebody else's phone automatically lights up saying, hey, you might have potentially come in contact with somebody that has now tested positive. But look at the nuances and the dangerousness of trying to depend on just Bluetooth technology. What if half your employees don't give you consent? What if they give you consent, but by accident or some other way turn the Bluetooth off? Or they leave their Bluetooth in their cubicle, but then walk to your office canteen, cafeteria to have a cup of coffee and spend 15, 20 minutes chatting up with colleagues, right? So leveraging just one Bluetooth technology or any one piece is a dangerous way of trying solving this problem. My suggestion would be to try and leverage as many weapons as possible to fight this pandemic. For example, we already did the wellness test. We know who's coming into the office. Well, that's a great way of knowing who is showing up on a particular day. When they badge into the building, maybe you want to integrate some badging tools with your centralized system to say, I know which floor who badged in or who badged out. Right? Badge access, by the way, is considered corporate property. Bluetooth on somebody's smartphone is not. Maybe your employees move with their laptops or smartphones, but they connect to your corporate Wi-Fi network. Well, you know which devices are connected to it and who are the people that own these devices. Wi-Fi access points, that's corporate data, right? So maybe all of us were sitting in this particular meeting in a big hall or in one of the convention rooms. Well, you may have all put this in your calendar. Guess what? Outlook calendar, Office 365, Google Calendar, as it is run by a corporate, is also considered corporate property. So leveraging different pieces of information that become available to you as a result of leveraging different technologies is a great way to combine both private and publicly available information to try and understand how your employees are moving, not to watch them, not to be the big brother, but to put the correct duty of care package in place so that should somebody test positive, you are making sure that you are reacting with informed data, deep analytics from the system, right? That will then help you put a good follow-up plan in place. What do you do with the person that has tested positive? What do you do with those people that spent the same time, same location? What do you do with the people that came to the same location afterwards? What do you do with the people and employees that were there in the prior shift? So if you have the correct analytics and if you are leveraging multiple pieces of technology, this would become very easy for us to make sure that we are keeping our employees safe. And then none of this is going to be solved manually, right? All of us feel responsible to do more than our part. And how do we therefore give those tools and techniques to employees? Maybe you want to give them a mobile app that has a bunch of self-service tools. They can wake up every morning and check their own symptoms. Remember, for a long time, smell was not considered as one of the symptoms. Well, a new guideline comes out from CDC and a new question comes up from the CDC, a new symptom check comes out from CDC. Shouldn't you be able to seamlessly add that? So next morning when your employees get up, they are now looking at the latest symptom checker, right? So provide some self-service tools so that they can help you by giving you deep analytics and meaningful information. If somebody wants to self-report, right, provide that as a self-service tool. Why do they have to walk into somebody's office? Why do they have to come to the branch office? Provide certain ways, means, and methods to make sure that they can come forward. Maybe they want to come forward in an anonymous mode. Maybe they want to come forward by revealing their identity, right? What you can do with it information will change based on whether they want to remain anonymous or not. But maybe you can look at technology that gives you those options, which is what will lead us to the next part of our discussion, which is how do we therefore balance privacy and security? One of the ways could be is to give your employees these self-service tools. There are other ways you can do that as well. But before we get into technology, I will speak of something that you folks are already aware of. And this doesn't get discussed as much, but I do think as HR managers, as responsible officers of the company, you're also obligated to reduce the liability. Make sure that you have the right information, but also compliance and audit trails to ensure that you've actually done your work well. Given that, I think we must make sure that any tool, any technology, any platform that you use, whether it is conducting wellness checks, making sure that the facilities team is sanitizing, making sure that you have the right amount of PPEs or masks within each branch office, making sure that you have an audit trail that you regularly run to make sure that should you get checked, right? Not only for your sake, but for the sake of the executives And anybody that wants to come and check, you can demonstrate that the operational framework is actually working. And there is evidence all along the way to make sure that every employee is aware of how you're conducting your operations. Now, a lot of things are going to happen, like we talked about from the perspective of risk. It just won't be the pandemic, right? But can we now put together a combination and make sure that we are now leveraging this pandemic as a new means to train the employees, right? You might be changing your corporate handbooks and employee handbooks right now as we speak. You must be publishing them, but nobody is coming to office. How do you seamlessly put that in the hands of the employees? How do you enforce that they've actually taken their training? We do this once every year on diversity and inclusion. Here's another dimension of compliance training that employees must undertake. This will also help reduce liability for you folks as HR teams. And then finally, this is perhaps the most important aspect of this entire situation. Because this is a health related pandemic, right? This is not a terrorist event. This is not an active assailant, right? This is not a disgruntled employee, and this is not, a supply chain. This is very personal. It's health related. This is that is supposed to be protected by the doctor patient privilege. So how do we now take pandemic related information, health related information, and bring it into your operational framework, right? And I think it starts with very simple, is you need to make sure that you give all the training necessary, all the education necessary for employees to understand what you're doing. How are you doing? What pieces of technology you're leveraging? What framework have you put in place? And then give the choice to the employees to opt in. And then whether you're using company's A contact tracing app, company B's contact tracing app, or you're doing any proximity based tracing, understand and assure yourself that no PII is ever exchanged. Point being that if Michelle and Prashant spend time with each other, we are carrying our contact tracing app. No matter what happens, my personal information cannot reach Michelle. Michelle's personal information cannot reach me. My identity, should I come forward, should not be revealed to Michelle, and vice versa, right? So we have to ensure that those pieces of technology are in place to ensure privacy and also share that transparently with our employees. The second is to make sure that we have the right access controls in place, whether your company is following role-based access control or you're leveraging some other form of technology. It's very important to understand and share with your employees who has access to what, who can run the contact tracing report. When I give my symptom checker, who is receiving the results of my symptoms? When I come forward and self-report, who can actually run and see my identity? Do I have the option to come forward in an anonymous mode? So a combination of all these is very, very important for us to understand and make sure that the employees have this information at their fingertips. And finally, what platform are you really using, right? It's great to say that I have created a new employee handbook. I have sought consent from all my employees. I have put an operational framework in place, but as I go to automate and digitize this operational framework, the platform that I'm using has not gone through any security and compliance certifications. I am not a HIPAA compliant platform. Well, then how are you going to exchange health related information with your employees, right? I am not SOC 1, 2, or 3 compliant, which means my platform could be subject to any kind of cyber threat. As you probably have seen, we haven't seen as many malware and ransomware attacks since COVID has begun. Why? Because all of us have started adopting remote tools, remote technologies. And so the number of incidents that we have seen rise in terms of phishing attacks, malware, right, viruses has quadrupled since this pandemic began. Now, is the platform that you're using vulnerable? Well, if you are not looking at these certifications, then you are dealing with a vendor or a platform that is going to become a threat vector for your organization, right? And then privacy guidelines, whether it is the German C5, the EU US Privacy Shield, or even the latest certification that has come out, which is ISO 27701. And then finally, for those that have businesses in the EU region or operating out of there, GDPR compliance, right? Put the burden of proof on the vendor that you're doing business with. It's great that you've defined the concept of understanding risk. We also have defined processes that we need to follow. But as you move forward to automating them, making that your part of your operational framework day in and day out, ensure that you're also looking at security and privacy on the platform that is helping you with the automation aspects of it. So in short, how can the world recover? I think that's the most apt way to put it. I mean, return to office, return to work, but as a society, I think we all owe it to ourselves to recover. I think we all trust our ingenuity as human beings. I believe we will have a vaccine soon. But at the same time, like Michelle was stating, I think our world has changed forever. We won't look at these things the way we used to look at these 6 months ago. Therefore, I think understanding the new world or the landscape that we operate in, right? Deeming what is recoverable, what kind of recovery systems that we need to put in our operational framework is very, very key. And then finally, our obligation in the end is to our employees. How do we protect our people? I think if we take those three elements that we discussed about understanding our risk, defining the framework, and protecting our people, I believe we have positioned ourselves to really do well and complete the duty of care obligations that we as HR folks have undertaken. With that, I will take a pause here. Michelle, Ty, if there are any questions, happy to take them right now.
Well, great. First of all, thank you so much. I know from my perspective that the things that you covered helped to sort of illuminate some of the maybe otherwise overwhelming considerations. I think a lot of us in HR feel that there's so much to consider. There's so much change in what requirements are, and having tools to be able to help us to navigate all of that in and of itself, I think is hugely important. And what I really loved was, thinking about the just-in-time aspect of all of this in terms of protection and decision making in the moment, being able to have the information that we need communicated in ways that are relatively fail-safe as well. So the adaptability, the versatility of these types of tools. I thought before I get into the questions, I would just mention that participants should be receiving a PDF of the slides from today. And so I encourage you to actually, spend some time outside of today's session reviewing those, because for instance, back on slide 12, there was a flow chart that I found to be extremely helpful to just kind of visualize those different decision points based on yes, no, etc. And I think that sometimes the visuals can help people to sort of wrap their heads around this. So I thought I would just start off with those remarks. I have some questions, and then also we'll be including some questions from the group. So let me get us to the Q&A slide here. And you can see here, I'm just paging through the great slides. By the way, this is the slide that I was referring to, slide 12 on the return to work. So again, I think that these can be resources for you, not only as you're attending today's webinar, but when you go back as well. And so let me go through some questions, again, that I have, as well as some that we've collected from our participants. And so, Prashant, the first question is really thinking about these specific privacy considerations and regulations. What in particular should HR departments be concerned about in relation to COVID in terms of those considerations and regulations?
Absolutely. So privacy is number one considerations. I mean, the first person I haven't seen in our discussions with many HR people, believe it or not, they almost have now their chief legal counsel or somebody from the legal office to understand, hey, how are we doing this? What information are you collecting. I think the most important thing is to understand, share, and transparently declare the pieces of information you have in your hand. And the bar is very high. And it's high at both the corporate level and also the vendor that you might want to choose to do business, right? For example, where is all the data getting stored? It's a basic question you should ask, right? Uh, and even before the pandemic, there were regulations in place, especially in European Union, where if you collected even the first and last name of an employee, you had to make sure that the data didn't leave the boundaries of the European Union. So something from as simple as where your data store is to who has access to what is very, very important. But I would urge all these specific privacy considerations are very well defined in German C5 compliance, ISO 27701, GDPR, right? So there are many of these certifications that are available standard that protect an employee privacy, but also give you a framework within which the HR departments can operate.
Yeah, and it's a good reminder that, again, depending on what industry someone's in, what size business, what type of business, they need to be thinking about these layers of local and state requirements, national requirements, but certainly then the international requirements. But, even just on sort of a U.S. basis, Americans with Disabilities Act, the FMLA,
Absolutely.
these limit what employers can request, how they can react once they're aware of an employee's medical situation. And, I mean, my understanding is, the employer should disclose to the other employees that another employee or a visitor is positive, but not disclose their identities, right? And so, that all is it's so important that we understand sort of the nesting of those. A related question. How can we help minimize the risk of one employee transferring that virus to other people?
Of course. It starts with the obvious. The obvious being, how have you considered your workplace safety guidelines? A lot of HR folks have gone ahead to facilities and removed cubes in between. Why? They want to keep 8 feet distance between all of them. There are occupancy thresholds that they have put in place per branch office. For example, each floor, what normally used to hold about 80 to 180 people, they're saying no more than 40, right? So point being, it again goes back to definition of your operational framework. What is your basic framework to make sure that to begin with you have proactive measures in place? I'll give you a simple example. A lot of folks leverage coffee machines, right? My suggestion would be do something as simple as keep a Clorox wipes box. Every employee that uses the coffee machine first wipes the coffee machine, uses it, wipes it again, right? There are some very, very simple things that we can put in place, but for each, you must do inventory management. You should define roles and responsibilities saying, when you're out of those Clorox wipes, who replaces them? Who's checking on the inventory? So those are some of the basic proactive things that we all need to think of when I discuss the concept of a framework. But then define those roles and responsibilities from the perspective of the unhappy path. Yes, somebody is responsible for the Clorox wipes. Somebody is cleaning your mouse and your desk and your monitor after your shift is over. But what is your operating procedure for exposure containment, right? How do I know who came in contact with this employee that has now come forward and tested positive? Do you know what other employees came into the office on the same day? Who are on the same floor as this particular employee? Do you have access to badging systems to answer that? Maybe when the world becomes normal, this employee traveled and sat on a flight. Who are the other colleagues and employees of that company that also took the same flight? So again, just like definition of the workflows that you were talking about, which were all the happy paths of it, there needs to be a process for exposure containment as well. It probably will start off manually, seeking input from the employee to say, when did you come, where did you go, who did you spend time with? But not every employee is going to remember what they did last 14 days, 15 days. Start looking at technology solutions that can help you as you move forward, would be my suggestion.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, because I was thinking lots of times we tend to think of this in terms of the sanitation and the, respiratory hygiene protocols and the spacing and all that. But to your point, having procedures for not just, okay, who's responsible for that? Who's going to do it if that person isn't in the office? And then also the containment aspect of it. I mean, that's where you say, gosh, if technology can help with this stuff, that's going to make it all just more manageable, it seems. So
Certainly.
yeah, I think a lot of people, one of the hot buttons with all of these considerations is that we're living in a time where people are hypersensitive to their sense of privacy. What are some of the least invasive ways to sort of manage, all of this kind of protocol that we're talking about here?
Yeah. And I think this is where technology comes to our rescue. There are two pretty invasive pieces of technology that probably HR folks will struggle with. One is GPS, second is Bluetooth, right? And GPS is specifically invasive because what it does is actually geolocates you within a few feet. You go down to your Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts coffee shop, well, I know you were there. You go to a library, well, I know you're there. You go to a park, I know you're there. So you can't always leverage those technologies that are pretty invasive. But I do want to assure everybody from a Bluetooth technology perspective, no location information is ever shared. And that's a unnatural fear that I have seen, at least in speaking with a lot of people. Bluetooth technology, if implemented correctly, only exchanges device keys, and hopefully whichever vendor that you do business with is not using any PII in these Bluetooth keys. And so this is just a device to device exchange in an encrypted fashion. And should somebody test positive, it is quite all right because it doesn't reveal the identity of the person or even the location of that person. But other than those two technologies, which are, I would call personal, badging systems, daily wellness checks, corporate Wi-Fi networks, your Outlook calendar, your corporate travel itinerary. All these pieces of information are generally considered corporate property, right? If all of us are, like I was saying, sitting in a room having this meeting, and all of us put it in our corporate calendar, the fact that we all sat in room number A to discuss this operational framework should be considered corporate property. So, like I was suggesting, the more of those corporate or public type information and technology you leverage, the easier that gets. And the most important thing is you'll actually get your employee to buy into those technologies because you now are no longer playing the role of a big brother.
Yeah. And so it's really this blending of sort of the engineering and technology controls and the administrative controls together. And certainly we've got like things like HIPAA out there. But I did, I've been kind of checking in periodically on the Senate bill that was introduced back in May on COVID-19, the Consumer Data Protection Act, that talks about disclosure requirements. And so again, that would be an example where should that end up ever moving forward for further consideration and movement into law, having the more universal kind of tools basically to support us would allow us to continue to evolve our practices with all of that. But
Exactly.
I guess something else I'm thinking about here is communication. So how can I communicate contact tracing expectations to my employees? Like, what are the things I should be thinking about as far as the actual communication?
Yeah, I think part of this is already in place. For example, I was discussing the concept of diversity and inclusion. Uh, at least for me in my company, and I'm pretty sure almost all corporations every year, it's mandatory for you to take this compliance training. So there's a vehicle already available. There's one problem with that vehicle. it only wakes up once a year, and that train comes to your station only once. The reality of this pandemic is that it is changing rapidly. One day you feel pretty good about it, and we say, all right, kids, all of you can go back to campus. 2 weeks later, we are all shutting the campuses down. We've seen this happen, specifically in this country. And so where the vehicle exists, what you have to look at is this vehicle, this bus, this train has to come to your station regularly. As guidelines change, that train has to come to your station and deliver the goods, right? As you change your corporate policy, it has to come to your station. So that's first aspect of it, is make sure that this vehicle now can be sent to each employee on demand. And then you can also say, hey, these are the obligations that the employee has. That's the first aspect of it. The second aspect of it is to try and support the needs of the employees themselves. And what do I mean by that? Not everybody carries a smartphone, right? So leveraging all this communication or sending the train using a mobile app may not be the best solution. Could you leverage mobile app and email? Well, could you leverage mobile app and SMS or text, right? Can you do a combination of those? Maybe, pretty significant and heavy duty compliance training. You can use your laptop. Simple poll questions. How are you feeling today? Can simply leverage text. A little more, deep questionnaire could leverage the mobile app. But the idea of communicating effectively is first to make sure that you have a cadence and rhythm of communication, which is far more frequent than the annual compliance training. Two, understand the technological nuances of the best way to communicate. Otherwise, the big risk HR managers run when they send too much communication is what? People start ignoring it. They
Right.
bulk select your emails and say mark as read. The bigger challenge here is to make sure that you can separate out alert from noise. Over communicating on one medium or leveraging the same medium to have 6 different kind of messages is dangerous. They will get ignored. So customize your communication plan to effectively communicate. Set expectations. Every Friday, you will receive a notification. No more than one notification. Every month, you're required to do this. No more than once a month. So it's those things that HR folks should consider.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I often think just in general when we're communicating with our employees, thinking about how much we're communicating and how much detail, how often we're communicating, what the different channels or mechanisms are that we're using to communicate, because we might have some people in our companies who use their technology, every waking moment of the day. And then we might have other people maybe in a factory setting who don't even have access to
Exactly.
some of the other technology. So I think really understanding the different types of employees that we have as well. Do you have any recommendations on resources to check out, and just to kind of, for all of us to keep ourselves up to date on this important topic?
Well, obviously, we are doing this webinar, and I'm pretty sure there are other subject matter experts doing that as well. But my recommendation would be that if we have to actually go to 5 different sources, right, 5 different sites every day, download spreadsheets from CDC or John Hopkins, or listen to what each governor has to say where your branch offices are, this model will not scale. There are a plethora of tools out there that will bring it all together for you, right? And it's just not the pandemic. You need to understand how, given the current political climate, how do protests affect your employees, right? Who is in harm's way? What about that wildfire that's raging? What about the next hurricane that might hit? Very soon we'll start discussing snowstorms. So unfortunately, there is not a simple answer to say, hey, what's the one place or one resource? But there are companies out there that are putting all of this together for the HR folks in a single platform, giving you multiple perspectives of the risks and telling you about the multiple risks as it pertains to your operational framework. So I would suggest at some point start looking at those vendors that can give you a little more holistic view and making it easy on your life.
Yeah, I agree because there's a lot there's no shortage of information unfortunately these days. But looking at, OSHA, the CDC, and then state and local government sites, it can be overwhelming. And of course, I do think that finding a vendor that can be relied on to keep the information current for you can be just a huge benefit in and of itself. But also, even HR Morning itself provides a lot of good information through their websites in terms of topics not only pertaining to what we're talking about today, but more generally. And even, places like the National Law Review, I was referring to that the other day in terms of some of the legal considerations around this. But again, if you are an HR department of one, I think, having an outside partner, so to speak, that is keeping track of a lot of this can ease so much of the burden so that you can focus on, frankly, of the other parts of your job as an HR professional. So this is an important topic. It's not going to go away anytime soon. And I think that we're going to see that this is going to permeate into other aspects of protecting our workforce and elevating sort of the way that people interact in the workplace as well. So I want to share our information as we close out here. If you have additional questions, we addressed many of them today. If there are additional questions later on or a question we didn't get to today that pertains more to the organizational side of things in terms of strategy, contingency planning, and those sorts of topics, feel free to reach out to me about those. And my contact information is there on the screen. It's also included in your PDF of the slides. And then if you have particular questions about today's topic and how these tools can be of assistance to you, then we encourage you to reach out to the team that Prashant is with over at Everbridge, and they can certainly help you with that as well. So Prashant, thank you so much for all of this this great guidance today. I never stopped learning myself, and I'm sure the participants appreciated it. Ty, any closing remarks as we close out today's session?
No, Michelle, I just wanted to thank you and Prashant for a great presentation. And on behalf of HR Morning, I would also like to thank everyone for attending the webinar. This concludes our program.